The scene is set.
Eucalyptus.
Invasive albino king snakes.
Emerald ash borer and its parasitoids.
The world's largest amphibians.
The invasive species that is humans. I'm Kirsten.
And I'm Nicholas. Welcome to the Anthropocene.
Okay, hi.
Hi.
I didn't get my snip done.
Why, pray tell? Isn't that what we have to release next, technically? But I guess we did a special episode, so you're kind of off the hook.
Yeah, I mean, so I could have literally just read the abstract and then give the summary of like the ecological concept, which I have ready, but I wanted to properly read the whole paper, so I'm not just like spitting out BS.
Oh, but that's what I do, so why can't we just both do that?
It's because I read the paper mostly already because I actually found it doing research for a real paper that I'm writing. It's really cool, and I'm like mostly done, but I don't know. It'll be ready for next time.
I mean, you should just be like me and take a break from writing all the papers that you have to write because you're fucking tired of them, even though you have to do them and they're due by the end of the year and there's like 2 weeks left in the year, and instead you just write a really long 9-page, it looks like it, script for this episode. So
oh goody, I'm scared. No, if it makes you feel better, I spent time today making episodes instead of doing paid work that I really, really need to do to be able to pay my credit card bill.
There's so much money flowing in this world that like you can afford to take who needs to eat every day, you know?
It's true. I could probably eat less. Just kidding. Anyway, you have 9 pages.
So there's 9 pages of content for this specific episode. We'll get into why that is. Obviously, I always say this, but you guys know what we're talking about. It's on the title. If you probably clicked on it because of the title. So it's not like I'm really teasing anything here, but there are 9 pages here, and my voice is just kind of not as strong as it should be because last night I did a drive around karaoke thing and I just absolutely strained my voice singing the high part to Dream On, and then also Every Time We Touch by Cascada. So, and obviously Backstreet Boys. But I guess without further ado, we can get into the episode.
Yeah, let's get started.
Okay. The scene is set. You find yourself in a lush tropical paradise, a whole new world. The depth of biodiversity overwhelms your senses as you struggle to take in the vast quantities of life that surround you. Where to begin? Plants? Insects? Reptiles and amphibians? Maybe the fish in the water or the birds in the trees. This new place is so much to take in. You take out your guidebooks and begin keying species out, yet you begin to realize something. The more species you identify, the less healthy the ecosystem becomes. But how can that be? The plants, the birds, the insects, the fish, they're all here, but they don't belong. None of this does. You begin to realize that this sea of biodiversity is actually an artificially constructed world, flooded with species from the world over, all competing to suffocate out life on every trophic level. Hello! I'm definitely editing out the part where I sang Aladdin.
I mean, normally I would say keep it, but it sounded like shit.
Yeah, here, let me try and do it better. I can't sing better. I'm not good.
I'm just kidding. It wasn't that bad, but I was a little surprised.
It wasn't planned. It just kind of happened. So we're rocking full ADHD Nicholas today. So it's going to make for hopefully a live episode.
I feel like people would be like listening because the scene is set is usually this kind of neat, like imagery, peaceful intro sort of thing, and then just be like, "Oh God."
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, that's probably what most people are, what happens to most people in most of our episodes because I inevitably scream something out of excitement. So
funny story before I let you run away with this. My friend Mari, who's a big fan. Hey Mari,
I'll rub it in my face,
you.
friends.
She likes to listen to podcasts to go to sleep, and she had just her playlist left on, and the hippo one came up,
mm-hmm.
and the part about the speed in which hippos go, which I will not ruin in case
Oh.
you all have not listened to it.
I forgot about that. I was like, what is she talking about?
Yes, came up and woke her up very late at night. So, I mean, if y'all haven't listened to the hippo episode, go do that. And Mari, I'm sorry for outing you on public. I almost said public radio, but
I'm not.
you know
That's
what I mean.
hilarious. How dare
It
you
was
try and
great.
fall asleep during our podcast? This is not an ASMR podcast. It could become one though. We could do a little ASMR content maybe for our Patreon.
I don't think my mic is strong enough to
I
pick
could
up
hear
the
it a little
tapping.
bit. I'll
Okay,
amplify the tapping in the editing. Okay.
All right.
So for those of you who haven't really keyed in onto it or just didn't read the intro and are listening to this as a playlist as you sleep, and second off, we're talking about Florida. We are covering perhaps one of the most ridiculous instances of invasive species in the world, if not the most aggressive, holistic invasion of non-native species the world has ever seen. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of content, but also I have tried to condense it down in a manner that makes this more of like a precursor episode to future episodes. So I kind of want to start off by saying, if you've opened this episode and you're expecting us to focus on a single species or even a specific type of animal like reptiles or amphibians, birds, etc., whatever, for this episode, that is not what we're going to be doing today. Today, we're going to go off and take a holistic approach on what we're going to be calling the most aggressive invasion in probably the history of the world. And somebody will probably dispute that in the comments. And to that, I say,
jog on.
I don't care. So we'll be taking a deep dive into the reasons behind why Florida has become invaded on such an encompassing scale and why the natural habitats and climates of Florida make it the perfect place to be overrun by a virtually incalculable amount of invasive species due to the negligence of humans. Again, we're at fault. If you want to get into the nitty-gritty of what an invasive species is, we talk about this in pretty much every goddamn episode that we've ever done, and we're not going to do it today. Probably. It might happen. Who knows? But we're going to be not going into a lot of detail on any specific topic here because we're covering so much. And if I were to, it would be just the longest episode in the world. So we will be exploring the impacts. We will be in... Oh, fuck me. We'll also be taking a little bit of a dive into control methods and practices implemented because we want to demonstrate that restoration practices are not infallible, and in some cases they can perhaps set the stage for the further success of invasive species and the eventual destruction of one of the most naturally and unnaturally biodiverse places in the whole United States. Because I don't think that it's fair to say that it's the most biodiverse place in the world. It just might have the most biodiverse range of invasive species.
Yeah, I don't think... I know Florida's a hot spot, but I'm pretty sure a lot of South American places have you beat for...
Oh, absolutely. And we'll actually talk
so,
about
yeah.
that too.
Okay. Very bold. I mean, I'm excited. You got some bold statements there, ready to
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
up.
Yeah. There's going to be some hot takes in this episode. So also, I think I'm going to do less editing and stuff because I think people like when they hear more of just like off the cuff talking and conversation. So unless I say something like egregiously stupid, I mean, I'm going to be cutting out all of the ums and stuff that kind of break up the listening for the audience, but I will be leaving more of the, oh, I fucked up, and I'm going to just leave that in because that's how it is. That's how, when I listen to podcasts, a lot of it is just kind of left in. I mean, at least the most popular ones. Maybe the scientific ones have a little bit more editing done to make them a bit more, concrete and kind of like, on the nose, but I ain't about that. That's not my lifestyle. That's not how I communicate. That's not how we do science education, at least not how I do it. So it's my episode. I'm doing what I want. We will be exploring the impacts of aquaculture, the pet and aquarium trade, food industries, and other human-caused impacts. I'll spoil the ending right now for most people because I do want to say this outright. The pet and aquarium trades are by far and away the largest contributors to invasive and non-native species introduction to the Florida ecosystems, and we will be diving deeper into that. This topic can, of course, be very controversial, but won't be the focus of our overall approach. We are looking at the factors that influence invasive species introduction overall. It just so happens to be that if we're looking at it from a numerical standpoint or a statistical standpoint, the vast majority of introductions come from the pet and aquarium trades. Rather than viewing this as a personal attack on reptile keepers or members of the pet trade, I want to get it out of the way immediately that we are just presenting facts and statistics. That's all we're doing. We are approaching this from a scientific standpoint and looking at the currently most effective and viable options for management and control, as well as preventative measures. There will be some opinions. I will state when it's an opinion. Kirsten will state when it's an opinion. Probably. Because I just told her she would. But we will. If it's an opinion, it'll be obvious that's an opinion. If we're stating numbers and statistics, they're peer-reviewed. They're cited sources. I got them all listed in the notes below. So that's not an attack on anybody. That is just what we're stating. We need to tackle this absolutely massive topic. So to do that, I've kind of broken it down into sections so that we can keep ourselves on track. So I can keep myself on track. Let's be honest, because I'm going to be the one that gets off track here, because I think that a lot of these points have plenty of avenues for like anecdotal speech. We could talk about any one of these topics forever. So rather than get bogged down on every subject, we'll try and keep things more general and concise. It would be insanely easy to overdo this and have it just get too thick with
the science sauce.
So we're not going to do that. We are going to try and present it in a way that is interesting, engaging, and kind of just tackles everything. I'm barely even wearing clothes right now. I should specify. I am wearing a tank top because I'm sweaty because I'm excited. And I came from the gym.
I'm impressed and surprised that you're wearing pants, because that's not always a thing, but
No. For reference, if you're not on Buy Me a Coffee or a Patreon, we record from my nipples up. So I might not wear pants when we're recording, but Kirsten has never seen that. She just is aware.
I'm just aware, yes. I mean, he could be lying too, but...
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah, so this is not my episode, so I'm not too aware on how much you're diving into things. But yeah, it'd be great if we show a general...
I would say scratching the surface.
Well, and the exciting thing about that is all of the windows that it opens for the other stuff later that we're going to get into. We can do so many episodes.
It's called job security, Kirsten. We are trying to get more content here. But what we're really using this for is for a reference for future episodes. So we can say, instead of having to break everything down for every invasive species that we cover that's in Florida or partly in Florida, we can just say, hey, go check out the Florida episode. So first off, we're going to be looking at the reason why Florida is such a great place for invasive species in the first place. We'll also be looking at the cost of management of invasive species within Florida. Will we? Hold on. We won't be doing that. I was going to talk about that, but I forgot. So we will in fact be discussing some of the current strategies and tactics, as well as where and why we believe these tactics are failing or falling short of where they should be. While I was writing this script, what I realized is there's just so much content that even at a surface level, you just can't cover everything. So I do think that I do a good job of covering the basics to set the framework for future episodes. But obviously there are going to be things that are left out. So, grain of salt when you're listening to this episode. If you're like, oh, I wish they had covered that, or I wish they had talked more in depth about that, you can feel free to comment that. But, it can be in a future episode because we obviously can't fit everything here. Our episodes are already long enough as they are. We don't want to have another 2-3 hour episode just because we couldn't really, get all of our information together.
Yeah, I mean, all good. Let us know what you want to get more into and let's get into it.
Yes. And a little bit of background housekeeping. I have actually spent time in Florida learning from and volunteering with experts in invasive species management within the Everglades. This isn't outside my own realm of knowledge and understanding. I'm not coming at it from a completely naive and unaware position. So essentially what I'm saying is I'm not a Midwest ecologist who knows nothing about the ecosystems of Florida and the invasive species. I'm not saying by any means am I an expert on the topic, but I do have background and I have worked with actual experts doing this invasive species management. Also, Kirsten lives in Ecuador, so her specialty would be tropical climate species when it comes to invasives. All that's basically just to say that we're not a couple of idiots who have no idea what we're talking about. I'm one idiot, and I kind of know what I'm talking about.
We got this. All right.
Well, we got it.
Lay it on me.
Will do. If we're looking at Florida and we want to figure out exactly what the reason behind invasive species success is, I'd say we can kind of chalk it up to two factors. One is natural, and the other is anthropogenic or human caused, and that one probably needs no explanation. But I'll go into it later anyway. First, we're going to take a look at the natural reasons why Florida creates a space that is separate from the rest of the United States regarding invasive species establishment. And honestly, it's pretty simple. All you need to do is look at the latitudinal diversity gradient, or the LDG, because that's much easier for me to say, and I don't have to say it in a British accent. But the latitudinal diversity is a biological term used to describe the fact that biodiversity decreases as you go further and further from the equator. That is to say, the most biodiversity on this planet in both forms of flora and fauna can be found nearest to the equator. With Florida, you've got the big old fat dick of the United States, which is operating as a peninsula extending to the same latitudes as mid-Mexico and basically all the way to the Caribbean. So higher temperature is indicative of higher biodiversity. The warmer a place naturally is, the more life it can support. Good, great, rad. Moving on. So temperature is not the only factor that affects this. You've also got other factors such as geology, weather, and of course, overall moisture. Rather than taking a deep dive into this, let me make it as simple as I possibly can, because we do have to move on to like the meat and potatoes of this topic. You can have a very warm area, such as a desert, that has distinctly less biodiversity than a similar temperature tropical rainforest. In the simplest way possible, which is a bit of a bastardization of the topic, you need a combination of moisture and temperature to get the most life. Water and warmth are going to get the most forms of life. Being a peninsula helps Florida with both, by creating a tropical climate that you see it similarly in places like South America, Africa, and Asia, where the most biodiverse rainforests on the planet are located. So what does this all mean? Well, if most of the biodiversity on the planet comes from similar climates, habitat, and latitudes as Florida, then most of the amount of species in the world have the potential to be successful in Florida. If you take the most animal species on Earth, they're not going to survive the further you get from the equator. The harshness of the cold creates an impassable barrier for the majority of invasive species, because the majority of all species are going to be near the equator where it's warm. Makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
Right, exactly. We have a place where invasive and non-native species can survive at a much higher rate than the rest of the world. But as we know, species can only become invasive if they spread by unnatural means. So that's the other factor that I was talking about, the anthropocentric or the human one. In this case, we're classifying humans as that unnatural means. Although we are animals that are moving animals, we are able to acknowledge and prevent our impacts, which does separate us from the rest of the natural world in that regard. And acknowledge our impacts we shall. First, first we clear our throats. First, let's take a look at just how bad the invasive problem is within Florida. And if you're not, you might want to sit down for this one, because it's probably far worse than you can ever imagine. I've broken this down into different sections, and the first section I go into the most detail, but as you will quickly see, it is impossible for me to do that without this whole episode only being this for 2 hours. So I'm going to kind of start in the most informational sense, and then as we get further and further down, I will kind of condense the information, because you get the idea at that point. So all of this information is provided by the FWC. If we're talking about invasive crocodilians. The spectacled caiman was introduced in the 1950s through the pet trade. The Morlitz crocodile was observed in 2017 with unknown introduction. Nile crocodile was observed in 1996 and was a zoo escape. The West African slender-snouted crocodile was observed in 1983, also a zoo escape. Smooth-fronted caiman, observed in 1999, introduced through the pet trade. Turtles. 34 species of turtles have all been introduced from the pet trade. 4 of those are established as invasive species, are known to be established as invasive species. More may be. Snakes. There are 40 species of non-native snakes. 5 of those have established. All the species I'm talking about are non-native, by the way. None of these are encompassing native species, for the record, in case that wasn't already clear. So, like I said, snakes, 40 species, 5 of which have established. Almost all of those are from the pet trade, with the inclusions of some in cargo, like the Brahminy blind snakes, which come in like plants and soil and stuff like that. Geckos, 28 species, 14 of which are established. The majority of those are from the pet trade, and some of those are cargo. So half of all of the gecko species that are non-native, 14 of those have established, or half of them have established, which is insane. Iguanas and relatives, so that like a lot of the agamids and things like that, 41 species, 21 of these established, almost all of them pet trade. Monitor lizards, 9 species, one of those which has established, which is actually pretty good. It must be harder for monitor lizards to establish, at least at this point. And all of those have been from the pet trade. Skinks and girdled lizards, which is just more, there's a lot of delineations for lizards, but there are 9 species. 3 of those are established, and all of the pet trade except 1. Whiptails and wall lizards, 8 species of non-native lizards detected. 6 of those are established, and all are from the pet trade except 1. Frogs, 21 species of frog. 4 of those have established. Most are from the pet trade and cargo, and then some unknown introductions. Salamanders, 6 species, 0 established, but all have been introduced from the pet trade. So salamanders, that one's not really a surprise given the climate of Florida and things like that they haven't survived as well, but that's also just what we know of. So we're getting even more broken down at this point. So there are 15 classes of fish. So when I was breaking down the geckos, iguanas, monitor lizards, frogs, those are what I'm considering the classes in this case. That's how they classified it on the FWC website. So there are 15 of those types of classes of fish, comprising so many species that I didn't even want to count them. And most of those are from the aquarium trade or aquaculture. And aquaculture is typically when you have fish farms for food purposes. So there are 16 classes of birds, comprising just an obscene amount of species. Again, I didn't want to count them all. Though there isn't really any methods of introduction listed on the FWC website. They just say that if they're present, unknown, established, or extirpated, which is a little bit weird. So that one was a little bit more hard to determine, like the full impacts of that. But the 5 classes of introduced mammals are rodents, weasels, bats, hoofed animals, and monkeys. So there are also species of that. Oh, and also unrelated, this is from the different website, not the FWC. I'm sure it encompasses all of this, but there's no way I would go through that. So there are an estimated 1,500 non-native plant species in Florida. And that's where I stopped. Obviously, there's going to be just pretty much an incalculable amount of invertebrates, insects, bugs, whatever you want to call them. But obviously, this problem is so severe that there's no way we could ever begin to encompass all of these in a single episode. After what you've just sat through, which is probably the most boring part of this episode, but also perhaps the most interesting, it's easy to see just how severe this problem is and how massive it is and how it encompasses the entire ecosystem throughout Florida. We're definitely going to make episodes out of a lot of these species to some degree, but probably for more of the heavy hitters. We'll do an episode on tegus, Burmese pythons, monkeys, and cane toads, and probably several more that I mentioned. And we've already done an episode on the invasive snakehead, so at least we can check one of those off the list. But since so many episodes are going to be derived from Florida in the future, I figured we could probably put a little background episode that we ourselves can reference in the future so that we don't have to waste half of every episode just explaining how things got so bad. So we'll be referencing this episode for sure. So if you're here from future episodes, welcome. It's good to see that we actually got our shit together and made more episodes. Now, here's where we're kind of going to be breaking down more of the causes of these introductions. I did mention for most of them what it was, but I do want to be very specific about it. It would be inaccurate to blame all invasive species presence on a singular method of introduction. As we've just demonstrated through that massive breakdown of all of these things, you've got pet trade, escaped zoo animals, aquaculture, research specimens, and even entertainment industries responsible for the myriad of invasive and non-native species present in Florida.
Entertainment industry as in sorry, as in they brought it here for like a movie and then like released it sort of thing. Like I'm just trying to see how that's different from like the pet trade.
Yes. So when I was in Florida, I was doing this like spring. I was paddling through one of like the Clearwater Springs or whatever on like a kayak thing. And there was the old Tarzan, whatever there. I like the stage, whatever, from like the 50s or something. And apparently, this is what I was told there. I don't know if this is true, but yes, they've been introduced for movies and things like that. And I was told that there was some of the monkeys that were introduced to Florida were from that specific movie, the Tarzan movie. There's also a few other introductions like escape zoos and things like that. But yes, the entertainment industry, I believe, in this specific instance, is a reference to the monkeys that were introduced from being brought in for movies.
Right. Okay. Wild. Cool. Just wanted to confirm that was the thing. It's so crazy that, to save a buck instead of going to a forest where there's monkeys, they're just going to toss a bunch in the trees.
And then the craziest part was they said they filmed and they were just like, well, we're done. Let them go. Like that was it. It was like the 50s. So,
yeah, I guess.
No responsibility for anything.
True. Okay. Cool. I just wanted to confirm that. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, it's fine. Continue. That's important. I thought about breaking it down, then I immediately forgot. So, although obviously there are so many multifaceted introductions, it is important to acknowledge primary responsibility, because if you're going to tackle a problem, you should probably focus on the one that's causing the biggest problem. It doesn't make sense to fight tiny little fires when there's a massive fire going on that's causing the main problem. A few instances of introduction are, of course, still notable and worth tackling, but as it has been made abundantly clear, the overwhelming majority of non-native species have been introduced in one manner: importation. For animals, this form of importation is the pet and aquarium trades, which I'm lumping together here, so as the animal trade.
Well, it's like aquariums. It's like you have fish for
it's
pets.
A pet. Yeah, so exactly.
Yeah, so it's okay. Yeah.
And then also I kind of am also lumping in like the animal trade with like aquaculture and stuff for that as well, which is not really pets, but you're also keeping these animals captive. It's the same gosh dang thing for the most part. I know we could break it down more, but I ain't gonna fucking do it because I don't wanna.
I've been reading a lot of papers on defining like invasives the other day, and like release from captivity is like actually one of the pieces of the model. So you have your transport, you have introduction, you have establishment, and then you have spread, which is the difference between, right, when Nicholas was saying it's here but it's not established necessarily. It's like between that two. But one of the barriers is release from captivity from humans or like accidental introduction. So
right,
you're okay.
Perfect. So not that anybody has ever like attacked us or anything, at least as far as I know, but like I do always like to cover my ass as much as possible, because like a lot of these topics are very they can be a little bit arbitrary, and you can make arguments against some of the stuff we say that isn't like direct facts, of course. But anyway, so for animals, like I said, it's the pet and aquarium and aquaculture, all that kind of stuff, which are pretty much responsible for, you can say, like the vast majority of all the invasive species. For plants, it's the landscaping and cultivation industries, which are responsible for the highest proportion of non-native invasive species. It's like that's the primary thing. There are two primary things if we're looking at flora and fauna, and those are them. I don't want to weaponize our blame here, though. It's easy to look at individuals within these respective communities and place blame directly on them. That isn't necessarily fair. Inherently, there shouldn't be anything wrong with keeping pets or wanting exotic plants. The problem comes from a lack of knowledge and intelligence on the impacts, as well as a lack of responsibility for the care and the, I guess, containment of these things that you are keeping. So the pet trade isn't inherently bad. I keep animals. I keep native to Illinois, not, I almost just native to Illinois exotic animals. That's oxymoronic. I keep native animals to Illinois for educational outreach purposes. The permit process I have to go through is extensive, but very easy. But it does help get rid of people who are not genuinely serious about the care of these animals. And that's a big step in the right direction for limiting the spread of invasive species through the pet trade. We'll get more into that, but I just wanted to put that anecdotally. It's not like I'm anti-pet trade because I actively own pet animals. Like I said, it's not inherently bad. It has the potential to expose people to a wide range of animals from all around the world that they wouldn't necessarily get to appreciate otherwise. That's great. However, poaching and wild collected animals have contributed to the drastic decline in wild populations of animals commonly seen in the pet trade. That's facts.
Yeah.
The more popular an animal is, the more it's collected, whether legally or illegally, from the wild, and the populations decline. One estimate states that up to 50% of turtles are threatened with extinction due to poaching. But put your fingers down, keyboard warriors. In order to provide a fair argument, I did look into this because this particular statistic was not from a peer-reviewed paper. So there are plenty of studies that state over 50% of wild turtles are threatened with extinction. That is peer-reviewed. However, the predominant contributing factors to that are habitat loss, climate change, and also poaching. I think the way that the data was meant to be determined in the article was that poaching and collection are contributing factors to the 50% decline, but it should not be interpreted as poaching and collection being the sole or main factors in the species decline. Regardless of that, the demand for animals collected in an unsustainable manner is both selfish and nearsighted. There is a clear appreciation for these animals and the people that want them, but an even clearer lack of understanding of their ecological importance and the impacts we are placing on their wild populations. If you love these animals, you should take care of their wild populations, which is where they belong and where they came from. You can't just selfishly keep all these things for yourself.
Yeah, wild animals are not pets.
Exactly.
That's a big one.
Well, I mean, also I'm just talking about like reptiles,
Right,
trade
wild,
and stuff.
also wild collected things, that are legally pets. But this also kind of loops back to where you're saying it's people not doing enough research to care for them because
Right. You just don't have enough knowledge about the topic to understand.
is checking in properly where companies source their animals, which you can totally be lied to.
Yeah,
and that's not
absolutely.
necessarily your fault. But yeah, I mean,
But most people
for
just
example, you want this type of turtle and you do a bit of research and you see that it's a hugely poached turtle in the world, like maybe you could try a different turtle.
Yeah,
right?
get a different turtle. It's fine.
Yeah.
There's so many options. And
Right.
I know people are like always coveting like the rarest and stuff animals. It's like, collecting the rarest Pokemon or whatever. But it's just, it doesn't work that way. Like it's incredibly selfish and narrow-minded to approach reptile keeping that way as these animals are rare, therefore I want them. It should be these animals are rare and I have a huge appreciation for them. So I will try my best to protect them. Otherwise, it's just, I mean, it's just complete. It doesn't make any sense. You don't care for the animals if that's your opinion. So this is obviously my opinion, and this is coming directly from me, but there is like a weird mentality within the captive animal trade that by keeping certain species within captivity, they are quote unquote, big old fucking air quotes here, preserving genetics. And let me be as clear as I can in this regard. You cannot re-release captive animals or release captive bred animals into the wild unless you are a certified institution that does so. And even then, there are strict limitations and regulations in place to mitigate potential impacts like disease introduction or unbalancing existing ecosystems. If your animals are taken from the wild, you're only removing genetics from the wild and making them scarcer, and they cannot be replaced. The argument that captive animals contribute to the conservation of wild animals in this capacity is baseless and ignorant. That was some shots fired from me directly.
If I may, yeah, like you said, conservation, breeding programs through zoos and that kind of thing is different. We're just talking about people who individually think they can do this and release them on their own.
Right. In case I wasn't clear enough in that, I am talking about like private keepers, not educational institutions like zoos or educational facilities like schools.
Yeah.
So the same can be said about the plant trade and landscaping industries, which capitalize on exotic plant introductions by selling them as prettier and more unique than native species. These species often escape and compete with native plants, changing entire ecosystems, making already imperiled native wildlife even further under pressure. There are, however, plenty of species that are known to not establish in certain areas or be incapable of reproducing. The pet trade and plant trades in their whole do not need to be banned or vilified. However, when species are shown by empirical scientific evidence to be detrimental to certain ecosystems, meaning if they are supported by science to hurt ecosystems, then it is our responsibility to acknowledge that and put regulations in place to prevent the decline in native biodiversity. Ecosystems provide beneficial services to humans. By harming these ecosystems with the introduction of invasive species, we're actively harming ourselves and the animals that we care about, and plants as well. Exposing people to this knowledge and helping them understand the dramatic impacts of invasive species on their own livelihood will only improve support for conservation and restoration. Meaning, if you're listening to this and you're angry about this topic like we all are, you don't need to go out and project that anger on people who identify within these trade communities. That's not a good way to get people on your side. Presenting them with information in a way that is attainable and not forceful and kind is going to get more support than being a dick. Nobody has ever changed their opinion after somebody got mad at them and go, you know what? The way you yelled at me and belittled me like that really made me change my perspective. No, they just put up more walls and it's more difficult and you've basically lost that fight because now they're not going to listen to anybody. So if they're listening to you, you've already got your foot in the door. Don't close that door on yourself.
Yeah, like intelligent education. Also, too, if you're super passionate about it and I don't know, you're in an area that like lobbying for legislation, like talking to your governments, your MPs, your MLAs, whatever, like that's going to get more work done. Like, yeah, going and getting mad and like there's people that try to like sabotage pet stores and things like that, or like buy pets and then release them, or I don't know, or steal pets and because they say that they shouldn't be selling them. Not helpful, fam. Not helpful.
Right. And also just more ass covering here. When I'm referring to the pet trade, I am specifically in this episode talking about the problems in Florida. I do recognize that on a global scale, the wildlife trade, which is inclusive but also separate from the pet trade, there are uses for medicinal, consumptional, and other purposes that drive much of the decline of rare species. So like when other countries specifically target very rare and endangered species for like aphrodisiacs and medicinal purposes and things like that, or just for consumption, I recognize that exists and is a problem, and I'm not doing an apples to oranges thing here. We're specifically talking about the pet trade and the problems in Florida during this episode. We can probably discuss the whole medicinal wildlife trade in a separate episode, but just so it's out there, I recognize that also exists and is massively problematic. That's just not within the scope of what we're talking about right now. We're discussing the pet trade as it is being the primary vector for non-native introductions. I think this is a good place to take a little break because I normally forget to do that. So we will be right back after a short message from nobody sponsoring us. Thank you for joining us for the first half of this episode of The Anthropocene. We're going to take a short break.
The Anthropocene is an independent project by young ecologists hoping to educate and share interesting information about introduced species around the world. If you'd like to help us by sponsoring an episode, check out the links in the show notes.
And we're back. So we're going to go through a lightning round now, kind of, more or less, I guess. This is where I've picked out various invasive species from different trophic levels, and I'm mainly focused on the most well-known individuals to demonstrate their impacts, because that's going to reach the broadest audience. We will get more into the nitty-gritty in different episodes like we've talked about. And as always, all these statistics are, of course, supported by peer-reviewed studies that will be listed in the show notes. So...
And a link to a Google Docs at the show notes. I'm just kidding.
Right,
Sorry.
correct.
Go ahead.
Because I have a lot of citations for this episode, which I haven't uploaded the script yet. So perhaps one of, if not the most famous invasive species in Florida. What do you think of when I think of Florida, or when you think of Florida invasive species? I am curious, Kirsten, what comes to mind? Because I obviously have my mentality, but I'm curious from somebody who's not really within the same communities as I am.
Yeah, like I don't know a ton about Florida because it's kind of far from where I've made my habitat in my life, but like it comes to mind because of things I've overheard, like the tree frog. There's that tree frog, iguanas, and there's a snake. I want to say those three are kind of big ones. I mean, other than like things like rats and cats, which are just that's like international, so that's like, yeah, we're not going there, but those are the three that like just came to my brain when you asked me. But
that's fair, yeah. So I would
Yeah.
agree with you on pretty much all those. I would say that's like pretty much what comes to my mind. Specifically though, the snake you're talking about, I would assume is the Burmese python.
yeah, I'm pretty sure that was the guy.
Right. So we'll talk a little bit about the Burmese python. We're definitely going to do a full episode on the Burmese pythons in the future, because they have become one of the most infamous invasive species in the entire world, in my opinion, and definitely one of the top in Florida. So they're responsible for 80 to 100% declines in certain mammal species, so like raccoons, opossum, rabbits, like your meso level mammals and things like that. As well as predation of native eggs of certain species of birds in areas that they have established. That's 80 to 100% decline. That's insane. That's like a massive impact right there.
Yeah, it's like impressive, especially from a snake. Like,
Yeah,
I know they reproduce pretty readily, but it's not
big
something
clutches,
that
large
you think
clutch
of.
size, yeah.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the first thing that comes to your mind when you're like selected things that like have young maturity rates and high reproduction and stuff. So neat.
Yeah, I don't think I really got into like their size, but Burmese pythons
Right.
can get upwards of 20 feet long, and when they're
Yeah.
born, they're still quite large. Like if you saw like a neonate, a newborn Burmese python, you would still be like, that's a pretty big snake for the most part.
Big
Obviously not in the
baby.
grand scheme of things, but I think most people in most places would be like, that's a pretty large snake. They consume a lot of bird eggs from endangered and imperiled species of birds, and probably predate birds directly as well. Estimates on population for this species, the Burmese python, is anywhere from tens of thousands to upwards of 1 million individuals throughout southern Florida. Though through new advances in detection methods, it does seem that more are gravitating towards the hundreds of thousands to over 1 million range, as we learn that their presence is significantly more than what we had originally anticipated. So again, we'll look more into this specifically on the Burmese python episode, but I did want to mention that there are several references. I've heard that the presence of Burmese pythons is having positive effects on populations of egg-laying mammals. Because they've demolished mammalian populations, there's less nest predation. And of course, on the surface, this sounds like a really good thing if you're one of these egg-laying individual animals. However, what it is actually showing is a severe imbalance in the natural components of an ecosystem, and this dramatic change in fauna can lead to entire trophic cascades, which can lead to entire ecosystem collapse. an increase of certain native species in place of another native species is not necessarily a good thing and can reflect an overall ecological imbalance, similar to what we saw with the brown tree snakes introduced into an area of like the Canary Islands, I think is where they're introduced.
Right. Well, I think like one of the easiest ones to think about is, you shoot the wolves and then there's too many deer, and deer are from there and deer are native, but they screw stuff up. So
they
like
eat
that's
more presence of deer equals more
Yeah.
plant predation of native plants, which makes more invasive plants come in. The higher presence of invasive worms that's there with the more invasive plants putting down more organic matter changes the entire soil horizon, and you get a trophic cascade, which is basically just the big butt fuckery of the entire ecological system. And yeah, that's the best way I can put that.
Sorry, this is a serious matter. I shouldn't laugh, but that was a surprise.
This is how I normally talk to adults, not children, when I'm teaching children. I've never used the phrase butt fuckery when I'm talking to a group of students.
Mommy, did you know that invasive species cause a whole butt fuckery trophic cascade?
You're fired.
Okay, sorry.
Next, we're going on to tegus. Tegus will eat gopher tortoises, crocodilian, bird, and sea turtle eggs, as well as juveniles of all of those. They will also eat eggs of rare bird species.
Okay,
so I probably should explain what a tegu is, right?
Yeah, I literally had to look up what a tegu is.
They're giant lizards.
Hate me, hurt people. Okay, they're cute.
They're large, not giant lizards, but they're very, very large and intelligent lizards that are very common in the pet trade. Specifically, I think in Florida, it's the Argentinian black and white tegu, which is the one that is the most problematic. There is a very specific reason why. Well, there's many reasons why. They're very intelligent. They're omnivorous, so they eat a variety of foods, but also, they have ectothermic temperature regulation, which is kind of oxymoronic in sound, but there is data to support the fact, well, there's concrete data that supports the fact that during certain times of the year, tegu's body temperature is raised above the ambient temperature around them, meaning they are regulating their body temperature to some degree.
Okay, so there's a little bit of endothermic regulation?
Not technically.
No,
it is ectothermic regulation, so it is
Okay.
probably a more efficient preservation method.
Okay, very
I
cool.
don't think it's necessary that they're raising the temperature, and if they are, they're not doing it in the same way that true endothermy works. I don't know enough about it to break it down. When we do the tegu episode, I will do enough research and talk to tegu people so I can get more information on it. But all you need to know is that they have the ability to somewhat regulate their body temperature.
Cool.
Which isn't unheard of in reptiles. Birds do it. Birds are endotherms.
Sure.
Dinosaurs were endotherms. So the fact that an ectotherm is slowly gaining the ability to do that is not like all that out of the spectrum of reality. It's just something that we really don't hear of much.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Yeah, I'm seeing, like, give this a quick Google if you've never seen one, if you're like me, because it's I see why people have them as pets, because it's just like a puppy lizard.
Yeah, they get very chubby and large, and they like are super food oriented, and they're intelligent. So they do recognize people from food, and they're just pretty much lay around like fat dogs.
Right. There's literally one laying beside a fat dog.
The thing is, they do make fantastic pets, but again, not in an area where they can become invasive.
Yeah. Okay.
In comparison to the Burmese python, there's quite a bit less research on their overall impacts on native animal populations in Florida, or just ecosystems as a whole. I know that when I was in Florida personally, the team of scientists there were working on some pretty novel research methods for determining their diet using stable isotopic analysis. That was really cool. So basically, they just look at the stable isotopes, which gives you basically correlations between what they're eating for the bulk of their lives and things like that, what their short-term and long-term diets are. And what it was stating was a lot of shit, just all over. I'm not going to get into it because I don't know if that data is published or whatnot, but it's a really cool thing that I'm sure the data will come out within the next few years here without me obviously like throwing their research under the bus.
Right. So it's like opportunistic, which is very common for a successful invasive species. They'll eat anything, so
right. And this data that I am talking about right now may actually be reflected in the citation I've listed for this dietary information, but I wouldn't know because I couldn't get access to the full article. So make it public. Regardless, a reptile that does have the capability to raise body temperature above ambient temperatures or has that preservation is going to be more scary, honestly, as an
Successful?
invasive
Okay.
species. Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
scary.
successful. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
more effective as an invasive species as far as reptiles go. So, also, if anybody has any knowledge of a tegu at all, they are like large. They get like 5-6 feet long with the tail. They're omnivorous and they're insanely intelligent. And when they're not habitualized to people, they're they're scary animals. They can bite. Their jaws are massive. They have long tails that they can whip you with, and they are super fast. I can't speak for like population estimates in any way because there's really no citations of anything that I could get access to. But when I did volunteer in Southern Florida many years ago, the team that I was with did capture several tegus in what in basically was a seemingly endless area in a time of year that they told me they were significantly less active. It was basically like their dormant season because even though it is warm in Florida year round, they do have a few months of inactivity. And even still, we were pulling out tegus. So I know that this doesn't speak to overall populations in any real scientific capacity, but it definitely reflects the presence of an established breeding population. And they're also listed as a species in many areas that are allowed to be captured and euthanized without permit because of their extremely invasive status. According to the FWC website, thousands of tegus have been removed from Florida, and they're listed as one of the prohibited species, along with many of the other ones I've already mentioned on this list, that are not allowed to be owned or sold in Florida anymore, which is something that the pet trade is just absolutely up in arms about. Moving on to the next species, the iguana. So I think the iguanas are pretty high up too on like famous species. I
I
think
said iguana.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think they're primarily noted for the structural damage that these species cause. The green iguana is one of the most famous invasive species in all of Florida. I think there's really no argument there. They're so frequently encountered that they are pretty much an expectation in like both local and tourist people's minds. They have a habit of burrowing under structures, which end up causing their eventual collapse. This can cause hundreds of thousands, if not estimates of millions of damages per year in structural repair costs. But they can also cause damage to seawalls and dams, which then obviously result in further problems when these structures no longer can function properly. On an ecological level, though, they are noted to consume and destroy a lot of native vegetation because they're herbivorous. Some of these herbivorous species, the plant species that they're consuming are of course listed as imperiled or endangered. The iguanas are also cited as outcompeting smaller lizards within similar niches. So I mean, obviously that does make sense. You got a large lizard. If there's other herbivorous lizards in the area, they're not going to outcompete this massive large lizard that's probably consuming a lot more biomass. You've also got more famous quotations newsworthy problems, which are generally exaggerated. They just get more media attention because they're different from the typical invasive news stories that we hear all the time. I'm specifically talking about the super famous, quote unquote, freezing iguanas falling out of trees. The way that the media was portraying this, it basically made it sound like it was going to be raining giant frozen lizards capable of shattering your neck the second you walk outside during a cold snap. Which, like, cool, I guess. You get to teach people about the ectothermic properties of reptiles, as well as expose them to the problems of these individuals as an invasive species. But I'm kind of conflicted on this as actually being a good thing or not. Like, what do you think? Because
Well, maybe not a good thing, but sorry. What I actually wanted to bring up was we were just talking the other day because the green iguana is native to coastal Ecuador.
right,
Like there's some in Guayaquil where my friend is from. And they actually, you have to be careful because they fall out of the trees and like a full grown male like falls and lands beside you. And they say it's like thump, like it could screw you up. They're
right.
also like, if they get aggressive and like swat you with their tail, they'll cut you open.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So they are actually, and I mean, they'll fight your dogs. They'll fight your dogs.
Well,
They
yeah,
will.
but dogs deserve it.
No, but No, the whole news, I think, overblowing things. Like we've touched on this before, like with the snake head and stuff too. Yeah, like
There's
it's
always
always too
dangers when you go
much.
outside. Like, I
Yeah,
think that
right.
there's like larger impact. My thing is like, yes, you are bringing attention to this, but I feel like you're kind of vilifying the animals themselves and not taking responsibility for it, as well as shifting the focus from like the actual impacts that they're making.
Right, but maybe somebody would see that and then say like, "Oh, I can't have an iguana as a pet because there's like iguanas that are gonna like fall on old ladies."
Right, but I feel like more people would be like, "Oh, I can't have iguanas as a pet because they destroy seawalls and could flood an entire my entire neighborhood."
Right, but that's not clickbait.
Exactly, yeah.
Frozen iguanas falling from trees is a much more interesting article.
Right. Okay, so
But
we're gonna move
no,
out of the
so what would
reptiles and
work?
amphibians. What?
Sorry, what would work is to write about that and then throw in a nice paragraph in there, like, "Hey," so that I mean, journalists,
Mhm.
do your
Yeah.
due diligence.
So we're gonna move away from the reptiles and amphibians, which are probably like what is most famous in Florida, in my opinion.
Mhm.
We're going to be moving on to the monkeys. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the macaques, which can maybe, like heavy super quotations, spread herpes. They are vector species for herpes, and they have transferred herpes from macaque to human in laboratory settings, but never, there's no documented cases of that happening in the wild, but they can maybe spread herpes. They do have the potential to do that. So they're also just like really dangerous because people will
Yeah.
like feed them and habitualize them. And we've seen this in other countries where they're native to, where they kind of turn to an aggression to take food from people because it works. They get the food from people. And they also attack people because for some reason, some people still don't see monkeys as dangerous animals. They think they're like all these cute little things, but they're kind of terrifying, and they have like they're super strong even for their size, and they have massive teeth, and like you can really get messed up from a monkey. And also, you should never feed wildlife in general. But of all the monkey species that are introduced, I mentioned there was like 5 or something like that.
Mhm.
The macaques are the ones that are cited as being the most likely to become a serious problem. Most notably, not because of just like them attacking people or whatever, but they consume bird eggs. Like they've been documented consuming like research station bird eggs that are like in research nests and things like that. And then obviously other eggs that are non documented. And also mangroves. And with mangroves, they can consume the tree to the point that they can actually kill off the trees entirely. So, as
Wow.
we have talked about in previous episodes, I think mangroves serve as like important storm buffers, and they've already been, and also erosion control and things like that. But basically, the storm surge come in because of their roots and because they are living in this brackish water and things like that. They actually stop most of the storm surge and prevent a lot of the flooding and things that come from hurricanes and all that kind of stuff, which is the primary source of damage during a hurricane is from that initial storm surge. However, without them there, then they don't have that same buffer. And mangroves, for the record, are already being reduced by development and climate change. So they don't need any more additional factors attacking their population numbers because people continue to develop closer and closer to the ocean, and then they have less and less of a buffer. And also, mangroves are kind of moving more inland due to climate change. They've kind of been like neo-native, neo-invasive up in different parts of Florida where they wouldn't normally be. But hey, Florida's going to be underwater soon anyway, so maybe it'll help them.
Yeah, mangroves are also like super important for a ton of young juvenile
Oh yeah,
like fish,
reproduction, yeah, because that
reptiles, like a
brackish
ton of things.
transitional water is so
Yeah.
important.
Well, and they can hide in them and stuff. Like if you've
Mhm.
ever been in a mangrove ecosystem, if you go snorkeling, like snorkel along the roots, and that's where you'll see all the stuff.
Everything, yeah,
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, yeah.
So finally, I'm just gonna one species of invasive plant. Like we said, there's like 1,500, but hydrilla is one of the most famous ones. It's a highly invasive aquatic macrophyte. It's submergent, grows under the water. It competes directly with native plants. Obviously, that's what an invasive species does, but it really outcompetes them drastically to the point where it can cause oxygen depletion and lead to fish kills because it just grows so significantly in an ecosystem. It also reduces water flow, prevents drainage, and does everything else that those super aggressive aquatic invasives do. Look at some of the other episodes we've talked about that. We do talk a little bit about it in the snakehead episode, I believe. But anyway, the point being is that there are so many invasive plant species. I just want to touch on one so people get an understanding that like it's holistic. This attack on Florida is a holistic attack on the ecosystems and biodiversity that normally calls it home. And now we get into the controversy. A couple of controversial topics to address, and we'll kind of wrap up the episode here. But we're going to talk about the capture and removal and euthanasia of invasive species and what you do with those species and impossible treatment methods and what you should be doing and what people think you should be doing and why those don't work or do work, blah, blah, blah. So let me start off here with saying and repeating myself, animals cannot be captured and sold in the pet trade because that's effectively how they got there in the first place. So, meaning invasive animals cannot be captured and then resold into the pet trade because they were introduced via the pet trade. The fact is, it is too large of a risk to rehome these captured non-native animals back into the pet trade in places that they can be released or escape and reestablish. However, is there a possibility that legislation could be put in place to transport animals to places that they are proven to be unable to establish and then reintroduce to the pet trade? Maybe. I personally think that there is potential for this to accommodate some of the captured animals. However, there isn't enough funding for this method currently, and perhaps the larger problem is the transport of these animals is absolutely not allowed. Though I do think that there are probably ways that licensed organizations may be able to one day tackle this, meaning that one day, maybe these animals that are captured would be able to, with certain legal restrictions and regulations, be transported to areas where they can't be invasive anymore. The problem is, if you're transporting these animals anywhere, even if it's out of the state, you're in the state for a period of time. So there's still potential for them to escape. So I'm not the one handing down these laws.
Yeah, seems like a waste of resource to me at the end of the
Yes.
day, as sad as it is. Yeah, but I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I do go into that a little bit. One argument that is also made quite a bit is that Burmese pythons, for one example, within their native range of East Asia are actually doing quite poorly, with their population decreasing due to a lot of human-caused factors, of course. So why would we not just ship the pythons back to their native range and release them? Well, there are a few good reasons as to why this is an impossibility. Genetically speaking, these animals are different. Not significantly enough to be like a different species or even subspecies or anything like that, but they've been reproducing in the Everglades for the last 40 years or so. They've picked up different parasites, gut biomes, pathogens, etc., that could actually be highly detrimental to native populations of Burmese pythons. All of those factors that I just mentioned could also affect other biodiversity within their native range that doesn't have the immune responses to deal with them. So unfortunately, it's not a viable option. All that is just to say, if you take those animals and introduce them, you could be introducing unforeseen invasive species in the form of parasites, bacteria, and disease, which are going to be significantly more detrimental to the native species populations. Sure, there are reintroduction and captive breeding reintroduction methods that can be done by licensed facilities, but they in no way can encompass the thousands upon thousands of pythons being removed from the Everglades. And this is just one example I'm using to cover the whole topic. Think of all of just the individual species that I mentioned of reptiles and amphibians. This is just one of them that cannot be accommodated. All of those, there's too many. Now we get into the controversial topic, the one that's difficult to address, which is euthanasia. A lot of people have a very understandable aversion to euthanasia because it is killing animals. And I'm not going to sit here and say that it's a glamorous topic. The one thing that I will say before all of this is that without killing those invasive species via euthanasia, those invasive species are killing countless more native species than if we are able to remove them and control their populations. So that is kind of my whole caveat for this whole following argument. But there are always going to be people who will make euthanasia evil and not treat it with the respect it deserves. And I'm not saying the people who are against it. I'm saying the people who are for it, but turn it into some weird hunting, I like to kill type thing. That's not what it's meant to be about. That's not what it should be about. And anybody who has that mentality is not going about it in the respectful way that should be done. You are taking the lives of these animals, and it is a very solemn and heartbreaking thing. When I worked down in the Everglades, everybody I worked with within this process clearly had their own personal difficulties dealing with it, because here's the thing. The people doing this, the people having to euthanize these animals, they're the ones that love these types of animals the most. The reason they're doing it is because they have a encompassing understanding of the impacts these species are having on the entire ecosystems, on the big picture. They take steps to do these methods not because they get some sick joy out of it, but because they understand it to be the most effective methods we have developed at present time. They're taking responsibility for all the people who couldn't and release these animals without understanding the consequences. These biologists, ecologists, and nature-loving people are carrying a lot more weight than just the responsibility of dealing with these invasive species. They're trying to take responsibility for the people harming ecosystems, and that's a ton of weight on their shoulders. Yeah. So think about
Yeah,
that.
so for sure, I think, if I may, like, if you're bothered by euthanasia of all these invasive species, like, the effective argument is to go towards the banning of these exotic species even coming in, and working with legislation to help avoid them being here in the first place. Like, take that angry energy that you have about the problem, and make it effective by tackling the root of the issue,
You
right?
can't say I
Yeah.
want all of these. I want to keep all these species, and then you can't go kill these species. That's the problem. Okay,
Right.
so I have in parentheses here pet trade stuff, depending on how much I feel like I want to discuss it. So I think that we've kind of covered it enough. I don't think we need to go into any more detail. This episode's already starting to run a little bit long. What I've said, I still stand by. I think that the pet trade is not inherently evil. I think it has turned into this very detrimental to biodiversity on a global scale problem that needs more regulation. And that's just the unfortunate truth, is that people, if they really do care about these animals, and I know a lot of you do, a lot of you do care about the animals that you keep, then you have to work a little harder, because your work to do a little bit more to own these animals properly and have that responsibility is going to separate you from the people who don't take enough responsibility and don't care enough for these animals and release them into the wild. Kirsten, you just talked about this, but regulations are good, right? But they do, of course, have the ability to go too far, because I'm not going to sit here and say, like, yeah, we should just conform to what the man says and follow all these laws that are in place. Nah, don't drink and drive, kids, but you can do some drugs. So the antithesis of what I just said about regulations having the ability to go too far is that people also have a tendency to go too far. So I'm going to state what my stance is on the regulations within the pet trade very clearly. Animals should not be able to be collected from the wild if their populations are not stable. There should be limits on how many animals can be collected of certain species, and restrictions for those species should be put in place to protect wild populations. I think those are all fair asks. Animals that have established or have the potential to establish within areas should be prohibited or require specific permits and licenses to own, so that any released animals can be traced back to owners and responsibility actually lies on their shoulders. If you are in a place where an animal can escape and survive, then that animal should not be allowed to be owned. Sure, if you're a hardcore reptile owner and that's your passion, it might be difficult to hear, but it is a privilege to own animals. And if you care about them, their well-being comes first, including those that you do not own that might be affected by the ones that you do. And of course, finally, Regulations on the opposite side of things should have to provide proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the species being regulated are capable of surviving and reproducing within the regulated areas. It does go both ways. They can't just start striking off a ton of species without something backing it up. Now, it doesn't take much. All you need to do is state, like, here is their native climate, and Florida is within the parameters of that climate and dietary needs. This animal has the potential to be invasive. Because the problem is, we can't do a hindsight thing and go, oh yeah, we can only regulate animals that have established. We need to put in preventative measures. And those preventative measures may seem strict at first, but once you break them down and understand them, they are preventative. They need to be put in place so that we don't have more problems like Burmese pythons. There is likely a much worse invasive species within the pet trade that just hasn't been introduced to Florida yet. And if we can prevent that animal from being there and causing even more problem for the ecosystems, then we have to do it. So I guess after all that, I don't really know that there's like a real way to kind of wrap all of this up. There's so much complexity and nuance to this episode and just the topics and species that we've barely even just scratched the surface of today. That's easy to formulate different perspectives and opinions on pretty much everything I've said, with the exception of obviously the statistics. But we're not here to fight with anybody or belittle or taunt people who see this from a different perspective than ourselves. We are here, however, to present information in a manner that provides insight into the topics of invasive species in Florida. In the future, we will be tackling some of these species individually, and hopefully we'll have some guests with more experience in the specific topics we've just touched on today. But for now, I do think that we can wrap up this episode as a solid introductory piece to the massive topic that is perhaps the most aggressive invasive species problem in the entire world, because it encompasses almost every single biological level within the ecosystem from an almost incalculable amount of species. That's it. That's all I got.
Yeah, I mean, well said. Yeah. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I like that you just touched on that we need to understand getting to the root of the issue, right? Like there's always layers and layers of things that are going on, and if we work as scientists and communities and governments to work on the root and the preventative stuff so we don't have worse things going on, then that's we're heading in the right direction if we're actually looking for the source of the problem and dealing with that instead of just picking away at, like you said, small fires that don't actually
absolutely
do anything.
And also, another takeaway too from this episode is just be nice when you're trying to spread this information out to people. Don't shove stuff in their faces or anything like that. It's not the way that we would want to learn or receive information, so therefore don't present that information in the same way that you wouldn't want to be presented yourself. Teach and educate others, but do it in a kind and understanding and patient way.
Exactly. Nice.
To prevent the butt fuckery.
Together, we can prevent the butt fuckery.
That is the new slogan of our podcast. United, we stop butt fuckery.
Well, thanks for tuning in, everyone, and we'll see you soon.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Anthropocene.
Be sure to follow us on all social media and feel free to reach out to us with any comments, corrections, or suggestions for future episodes or species you'd like to see us cover. A whole new world.